They grabbed Lieutenant James Halbrook the moment Tobruk fell. Dust still hung in the air from the shelling, and the last British resistance had collapsed. A German patrol marched him out with dozens of others, but even then, in the back of a transport truck, wrists tied, James wasn't thinking of surrender. He was already studying the guards, counting them, watching which one looked the most careless with his rifle, looking for the first crack in the wall. By the time they reached the POW camp in Bavaria, he'd already tried slipping out once, rolled out the back of a moving truck during a sharp bend, thought the ditch would shield him. It didn't. A snap of German shouts and a bayonet to the shoulder was his reward. That was escape attempt 1, and a lesson. Never try it without knowing what's ahead. Camp 14B was no joke. Barbed wire in triple layers, guard towers with spotlights, dogs that barked at the sound of breath. But James Halbrook didn't care. He wasn't made for sitting still. He'd been an engineer back in Britain, not just building bridges, but solving problems. The kind of man who saw systems and flaws in every structure. And this prison was just another system. It could be broken. The second attempt came only 3 weeks later. He hid beneath a laundry cart, smuggled toward the outer fence. Made it 30 feet before the cart hit a stone and flipped. 2 guards pulled him out by the legs and slammed him to the ground. Broken ribs and 3 days in solitary. But he remembered the path, counted the guard rotations, learned the laundry boys' schedules. The third time he tried digging. Not a full tunnel, just enough to slip under the inner fence. Dug with a mess tin at night, hid the dirt in his mattress. On the night of the attempt, he got under, but never made it past the second fence. A patrolling dog caught the scent. The handler let it lunge. It bit down hard into his calf. He screamed and fought it off, but they dragged him back before sunrise. Infection set in. Fever for 2 weeks. But now he knew where they kept the dogs at night. Another piece of the puzzle. Escape 4 was bold. Too bold. He and 2 other prisoners stole guard uniforms from the laundry room, tried to march out during a shift change. James thought he could copy the German accent, act like he belonged, but the real guard he impersonated showed up minutes later. That time they beat him bad. Knocked out 3 teeth. Still he noticed something. The shift change chaos. The confusion. That could be useful. 5 and 6 were solo jobs. 1 involved crawling under a garbage truck, clinging to the oily axle. The guards noticed oil dripping and checked underneath. The other was faking illness, getting taken to the infirmary, then trying to slip out through the back during a blackout. He never made it past the courtyard, but he learned where the medical supplies were stored. That might help later, especially for cold or wounds. Escape 7 was reckless. He tried scaling the outer fence during a storm when the guards seemed distracted. Got halfway up before the spotlight swung his way. They shot at him, a graze across the shoulder, fell hard, blacked out. Woke up in the infirmary, chained to a bed. Attempt 8 involved bribing a German cook with a silver ring he'd hidden in his boot heel. The cook agreed to hide him in a bread cart. But the man got nervous, reported James instead. It cost the cook his job. Cost James another month in solitary and a cracked cheekbone. 9th time, James worked with 2 others again. Dug a full tunnel. Under the barracks, took them 3 months. But the soil started collapsing halfway through. It was discovered during morning inspection when one of the men misstepped and the floor dipped. They filled it in with concrete. James nearly gave up that time. Almost. But he didn't. He just started planning again. Because the 10th one had to work. It had to. James kept to himself after the 9th failure. His body ached constantly. Old wounds reopening. Fingers that wouldn't bend right from the cold or breaks. A dull throb behind his left eye that never went away. But he didn't stop thinking. Not for a second. He had stopped hoping, maybe, but not planning. The others noticed. They gave him space. Even the guards were quieter around him now. He was no longer a prisoner in their eyes. He was the escape guy, almost like a joke, like a madman with nothing better to do. Even they stopped fearing him, and that was their mistake. What they didn't know was that James had spent months mapping out every square inch of that camp, not on paper, but in his head. He knew where each pipe ran, knew which guard smoked, during night shifts and where he leaned against the wall to light his cigarette. He knew when the supply trucks came and which ones were local versus cross-regional. Most importantly, he had learned to be invisible. James also knew winter was coming, and this year, it was going to be the worst one yet, a blessing and a curse. Snow meant clearer footprints, but it also meant darkness came early and stayed long. It meant trucks had to idle longer, engines steaming in the cold, and it meant a higher chance of a supply route freezing over, and perhaps being walked. So, he waited. Waited through November, doing what he had to. Ate quietly. Followed orders. Looked beaten. Looked like a man who had given up. That part was crucial. He even refused a chance to help another prisoner try something in late December. They thought he was broken. One of the guards even started calling him Old Dog. They stopped watching him so closely. That was their second mistake. He used the infirmary now and then, played up an old wound, limped just a little when he had to. Got into their good graces enough that a nurse, a Polish woman, started speaking to him when the others weren't around. She didn't help him, but she didn't turn away when he asked about maps. About which villages lay north of the camp. About the terrain. One night, he stole a spoon from the infirmary's kitchen, not to dig, but to undo bolts. The bolts under a supply truck's floorboard, one that came every other Friday and always stayed longer due to brake issues. That truck had a heater underneath the main cargo space, a heater that fed through a hatch just wide enough for a man to squeeze in. If he could fit. If he could stay silent for 4 hours. He made a fake pipe to match one missing under the truck, rolled it from tin sheets and covered it in oil. Practiced crawling into the crawl space under his bunk again and again until his joints obeyed like they used to. He fasted for 2 days before the attempt so his stomach wouldn't make noise. He wrapped his legs with strips torn from a blanket to muffle movement, and he timed everything. The escape was set for January 14th. At 03:12 a.m., James slipped out of his barrack, crawled under the truck before the guards made their rounds, and lodged himself beneath the floor, beside the heater's casing. No food, no water. Just him, cloth-wrapped, breath held, silent as death. The truck didn't leave until 07:40 a.m. 4.5 hours of lying still while guards and dogs passed by within feet of him. His breath slowed. His muscles screamed. But he didn't move. Not even when a guard lit a cigarette and leaned against the truck's side. By the time the truck rolled out of the gates, James was already slipping into unconsciousness from the cold and pain. But he held on. Held on all the way to the supply depot. That's where everything went wrong again. The truck jolted to a stop after what felt like a lifetime of grinding gears and frozen air. James forced his eyes open. His body was numb. Lips cracked and fingers stiff from holding still. But his mind was sharp. He had counted turns, listened to the pitch of the engine, measured distance by sound, by time. He guessed they were 30 kilometers from the camp, maybe more. He waited. Waited as boots crunched on gravel, voices barked in German, cargo doors slammed open. No one looked beneath. No one even checked. Then came the lift. The metal floor creaked as crates were offloaded above him. This was his chance. He'd have only seconds once the truck was empty. At last, silence. No voices. Just wind. James crawled out slowly, knees like rusted hinges. His legs barely worked, but he moved anyway, dragging himself from under the chassis behind a stack of barrels. His heart pounded louder than it ever had. He waited again. 10 minutes. Maybe more. When he was sure no one was near, he ran, or limped really, toward the edge of the depot, but a voice stopped him cold. Halt! A young soldier had seen him, just a kid, barely 19. James bolted. His body screamed, but he pushed. The boy fired, missed. James dove behind a shed, then rolled down a slope into a frozen drainage ditch. He stayed underwater. Barely. An inch of filthy runoff, as the boots thundered above him. He didn't breathe, didn't think. They searched for hours. Dogs barked, voices echoed. James pressed himself into the mud, shaking, frost biting into his bones. But somehow, they missed him. The boy who saw him wasn't sure what he saw. They couldn't track footprints in the icy mix. Eventually, they gave up. That night, James crawled out of the ditch and limped into the woods. He didn't know where he was, didn't care. All he knew was that he wasn't in the camp anymore. His boots were gone. He had torn cloth tied to his feet, soaked and frozen. Each step was agony, but he moved. He followed distant lights, found an abandoned barn and slept inside a pile of hay. The next day, he stole bread from a windowsill. Didn't even feel guilty. He needed it more than they did. But he was in Bavaria, deep in enemy territory, and the snow wouldn't stop falling. He kept to the woods during the day, moved at night, avoided roads, avoided people, slept under broken carts, in root cellars, sometimes nothing at all. Hunger burned him. Cold cut his skin like knives. Once he heard a patrol nearby and lay still for 12 hours, belly pressed against frozen ground, lips purple. He got lost. Several times. But every mistake added another lesson. Don't follow rivers. They lead to towns. Don't steal from the same place twice. Don't trust dogs. And always, always keep moving. On the 6th night he reached a farmhouse. He watched from the tree line. No soldiers. Just a woman and 2 children. He waited until she left for then slipped into the barn, found a pair of old boots, too small but better than rags. He took a coat too, a child's coat barely reaching his wrists. But he didn't stop. He kept walking. Through villages that never saw him. Past fences he ducked under. Past watchtowers where he lay flat in ditches. One night, he collapsed. Woke, up 2 days later in a stranger's bed, not a German. A Swiss farmer. Quiet man. Looked at him with narrow eyes. Didn't speak. Just left him soup and bandages. Said nothing about the blood in the sheets. For the first time in 2 years, James slept without fear of being dragged back in chains. But he wasn't safe yet. Not even close. Because the border was still 30 miles away, and the Germans were looking for him. The farmer didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. One look at James, sunken eyes, blood-crusted hands, the stitched coat and swollen feet, told him everything. He just nodded once when James tried to speak, placed a single finger to his lips, and left the room. For 3 days, James stayed in that tiny room above the barn. The window overlooked a field that met the woods. Nothing moved out there. No patrols. No voices. The farmer brought bread and broth, rubbed something bitter-smelling on James's frostbitten toes, and always locked the door behind him when he left. Not out of mistrust, out of protection. On the 4th night, the farmer entered silently, holding a small tin box. He opened it and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a hand-drawn map. His finger tapped twice on a point near the bottom. Schweizer. Grenze, Swiss border. Then he pointed to another dot farther south. Hier, you. Heute Nacht du gehst. Kein Licht, kein Straße, nur Wald. James understood. He was here. Tonight he had to leave. No roads, no lights. Just the woods. He nodded. The man gave him a pair of wool socks, thicker boots, and a scarf that smelled like sheep. Then he walked him out the back of the house, led him into the trees, and pointed north. Geh, schnell, nicht zurückschauen. James shook his hand, tried to say something, anything. But the man just gave a half-smile, turned, and walked back toward his farm. Not a word more. James began walking. He kept the scarf tight around his face. His body screamed from the cold, but he'd grown used to pain. What worried him now was time. He had no idea how long the Germans had been searching. No idea if they were still on his trail, or if the radio had already described his face in a dozen villages. He crossed a frozen creek by dawn, climbed a slope that tore the skin from his palms. Once he heard barking in the distance and hid under fallen branches for nearly an hour, but no one came, just the wind, cruel as ever. By noon he reached an old logging path. On instinct, he turned away from it, heading back into thicker woods. He knew better than to trust open paths now. Every mile was a risk. Every tree could hide a rifle. Around dusk he reached a fence, wooden, broken in places. He recognized it from the map. This was the outer edge of the old mining zone, which meant he was only a day, maybe less, from Switzerland. But that's where it all almost ended. As he crossed the fence, something snapped beneath his foot. A buried metal trap. It didn't catch him, but it sent him sprawling. And in the second it took him to rise, a voice barked in German from behind. Halt! Hände hoch! 2 men. Armed. One had a dog. James froze. He raised his hands slowly, heart pounding. The older soldier stepped forward, rifle steady. He looked tired, cold, not cruel, but not kind either. The dog barked once but didn't lunge. James didn't speak. The soldier motioned to the younger one. They began patting him down, found nothing but a pocket knife and a piece of crusty bread. They didn't know who he was. Not yet. Then one of them spotted the British uniform underneath the layers. Just a glimpse. Enough. Englander. James acted without thinking. Slammed his elbow into the younger one's face and lunged for the older's rifle. The dog snapped, caught his arm, but he twisted, slammed the butt of the rifle into the soldier's head. Chaos, screams, snow flying, blood on bark. He ran. Didn't look back. Didn't stop, even when the barking faded. Didn't stop, even when his lungs burned and his feet bled through his boots, because somewhere in the dark ahead was freedom. James didn't know how long he ran. His legs were moving on their own, out of panic more than purpose. The trees blurred past. His breath came in short, tearing gasps. His right arm throbbed where the dog had bitten him, but he kept going. Somewhere behind him, the 2 soldiers might have been alive, or maybe dead. He didn't know. He didn't care. He couldn't care. He moved until his knees buckled. Until the snow finally swallowed him. He lay face down, chest heaving, vision spinning, and he thought, this might be it. This might be where it ends. But then, through the ringing in his ears and the pounding of blood in his skull, he remembered. He hadn't made it yet. He was close. So close. And dying here would be worse than capture, because it would mean everything before, every failure, every beating, every drop of blood, was for nothing. So, he crawled, through snow and dirt, around bramble that tore at his coat, over tree roots that mocked his ruined boots. The sun had dipped completely now. The woods were pitch black, but he kept crawling, guided only by the sound of silence. No boots, no dogs, no voices, just the rhythm of his breath, and the memory of the farmer's map burned into his brain. At some point, he found a stream, shallow but moving. He followed it. Streams always knew the way down, and down was where valleys were, and valleys meant borders, maybe even the one he needed. He lost count of the hours. Then, in the early edge of dawn, the trees thinned, and there it was, a clearing, a barbed wire fence, shorter, simpler than the ones at the camp. Just one layer, weathered. No guards, no towers, no dogs. Just the kind of border a neutral country might throw up during wartime to make a point but not really enforce. James froze. Could it really be? He took a slow step forward, then another. Each one sent pain shooting up his legs, but he didn't stop. When he reached the fence, he didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He threw himself over it. The barbed wire tore through his trousers, cut deep into his thigh, but he didn't care. He landed hard on the other side, laid there, breathing, waiting, nothing, no shouting, no sirens, no gunshots, just the sound of his own heartbeat, echoing, in his ears like a drum. He got up, limped forward, 10 feet, 20, 30, then he saw it, a small wooden post, nearly buried in snow, letters carved into it, barely visible. Schweiz, Switzerland. He didn't cry, he didn't cheer, he basalt, just stood there swaying like a man ready to fall. And then finally, he did. Collapsed, face first into the snow. When he woke, it was to the sound of voices, not German, not English, but something softer. Swiss. Neutral. A face hovered over him, a man in a thick coat, a red cross on his sleeve. British, the man asked gently. James tried to speak. Only air came out. He nodded. The man called over his shoulder, shouted something. Others appeared. They lifted James, careful not to hurt him. One held his hand. Another pressed something warm into it. A flask. He sipped. Tea. Real tea. He nearly wept. He was taken to a small house near a village. Real beds. Clean sheets. Heat. They washed his wounds, stitched his leg, bandaged his arm, fed him, let him sleep. No questions, no demands, just care. 3 days later, a British consulate officer arrived. When the man asked his name, James almost couldn't say it. His voice cracked. His eyes stung. "Lieutenant James Halbrook," he rasped. The officer blinked. "Wait, the Halbrook? The one who escaped 9 times?" James didn't answer, he just smiled. Because this time, the 10th time, he had finally made it. The British consulate officer sat across from James with a stunned expression, hands folded neatly on the small table between them. James was bundled in a thick wool sweater, a fresh bandage on his cheek, fingers wrapped in clean gauze. The fireplace crackled behind them, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he wasn't cold. "You understand," the officer said slowly. "We've heard stories, rumors. A British POW who kept escaping. They called him the ghost of Camp 14B. James gave a faint shrug. "Never liked that place." The officer chuckled, more out of disbelief than humor. 9 times, and you kept going. "I wasn't built to sit and wait for someone else to win the war," James said, voice still hoarse. "Freedom. It was the only thing that ever made sense." The officer studied him. "You know you've become something of a legend. The German command even issued a standing order. If Halbrook escapes again, do not return him to 14B. Said, it was bad for morale." James leaned back, the smallest smirk tugging at his cracked lips. "Guess I was good for something after all." But beneath the calm, the weight of it all pressed heavy. His body was broken in more places than he could count. His leg was infected. He'd lost 2 toes to frostbite. His hearing in one ear was shot. And the nightmares, those had already started. Still, when the officer leaned in and asked, "Do you want to return to London immediately, or spend a few more days recovering?" James didn't hesitate. London. The train to Geneva was quiet. No guards, no dogs, no rifles aimed at his back, just passengers, Swiss, French, a few displaced travelers. The countryside rolled by peacefully, untouched by war. It felt unreal. He almost expected to wake up in the dirt, a boot on his neck, a spotlight in his eyes. But it didn't happen. From Geneva, he was flown to England. A military plane, special arrangement. He sat by the window watching the clouds. No one asked for his papers. No one shouted orders. A nurse handed him a warm blanket and called him sir. He didn't know how to react. Back in London, the reception was quiet. No parade, no journalists. Just 2 officers from the War Office, a private car, and a clipboard full of forms. They debriefed him in a small room in Whitehall, where men in uniforms listened to every detail of his escape like it was fiction. He told them everything: the tunnels, the failures, the farmer, the boy with the dog. He even described the final run to the Swiss border. One of the officers, a general with a heavy mustache, sat back at the end and exhaled. "Well, Lieutenant Halbrook, you're either the most stubborn man alive or the luckiest." James smiled. "Little bit of both, maybe." The War Office didn't send him back to the front. They wanted him to rest, heal, maybe tour a few training centers, share his experience. He declined the tour, asked for quiet instead. He was given a room in a recovery center in Surrey, a modest place tucked behind fields and woods. The staff were kind. The food was warm. No one screamed in the night, not even him. Days passed slowly. Sometimes other officers would visit. They'd heard the story, wanted to shake his hand, call him a hero. But James didn't feel like one. He didn't talk much, just sat near the window, looked out at the trees, and thought about the camp, about the faces of the men who didn't make it, the ones who tried with him, the ones who died trying. He remembered their names, every single one. And that's when he made a decision. He wasn't going to fade into quiet. He was going to do something, not with weapons, not with plans, but with truth. The world needed to know what really happened in those camps, and James Halbrook was going to tell them. The first letter James wrote was to the family of Corporal Reggie Lawson, one of the men who had helped him dig the 7th tunnel. Reggie never made it out, shot in the back when the tunnel caved and they got caught. James remembered the sound, The way Reggie's body hit the ground like a sack of wet cement, and how he'd begged the guards to let them bury him. They refused. He wrote it by hand. No official stamps, no military formatting, just ink and honesty. He told them everything. The way Reggie had kept morale up, the way he'd risked his own rations to help others, how he never once stopped, believing they could escape. He died with his hands dirty and his heart full, James wrote. You raised a good man. Then came the next letter, and another. Every week, he wrote. Not for glory, but because it was the only thing that kept the guilt from swallowing him whole. For every man he named, there were 10 more whose names he barely remembered. Men who didn't get a final word, who disappeared into the camp's silence, like ghosts. At first, the War Office didn't notice. They were busy filing him away, as a quiet success. But word spread. One of his letters was published, with the family's permission, in a local paper. Then a London one. Then the BBC called. James refused all interviews. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted the truth to be famous. Still, they insisted. A major from the War Office visited him, carrying a folder of press requests. You're becoming something of a symbol, Halbrook. I'm not a symbol, James replied. I'm a man who got lucky, and a lot of good men didn't. The major paused. Then help their memory live. Let us tell their story. That night, James agreed, but on one condition. No dramatization, no exaggeration, just facts, just names, just the raw, brutal truth. The first radio broadcast came a week later. A calm narrator, a stiff BBC voice, read from James's account. The public listened, silent and still. Mothers cried. Veterans nodded in solemn recognition. People heard things they weren't ready for, about beatings, starvation, the mock executions, about the hopeless nights in solitary and the screams that never stopped. But they also heard about bravery, about the stolen laughs, the friendships forged in hell, and the defiance of a man who refused to give up, even after being caught 9 times. By spring of 1944, James's story had traveled further than he ever expected. Allied troops in North Africa were quoting it. Resistance fighters in France were circulating parts of his letters. Even the Americans picked it up, calling him the man who wouldn't stay caged. But for James, none of it mattered. If the men he'd known were forgotten, so he kept writing. He visited hospitals, speaking to wounded soldiers, sharing what hope he could. He walked into offices with his limp and frostbitten fingers, demanding better treatment for returned POWs. He stood in front of rooms full of officers and told them what their men were really going through in those camps. The hunger, the humiliation, the slow grind of sanity. Don't decorate me, he once snapped at a general who offered him a medal. Feed the men who are still in cages. In April, he received a letter, an official document stamped by the Geneva Convention Office. They had received word that Germany had moved all escape-prone POWs to a harsher, unnamed camp. Camp 14B had been shut down. A quiet smile tugged at his mouth when he read it. One camp gone. One less cage. James folded the letter and slid it into a box beside his bed. A box filled with every name, every drawing, every scrap of his journey. He wasn't done yet. There was still more to tell, because the world was listening now, and James Halbrook wasn't about to let it forget. By summer of 1944, James Halbrook was no longer just a name whispered in prison camps or filed in German reports. He was a quiet force behind something larger, not a war hero in the traditional sense, but a symbol of what happened after the battles, inside the fences, behind the closed gates where most men were meant to rot and be forgotten. The War Office reluctantly leaned into his growing influence. They didn't always like it. James spoke too plainly, too honestly. He didn't soften the ugliness. When they asked him to approve a dramatized radio play based loosely on his escape, he refused outright. This isn't a bedtime story, he told them. This was blood, sweat, and screaming. Instead, he pushed for a written account. Not fiction. A detailed, unembellished account of everything. The escapes, the beatings, the men who didn't make it. He wanted it in libraries, in schools, on the desks of diplomats. A reminder of what war really meant when the shooting stopped, and the cages closed, He called it 10 Tries to Freedom. He wrote it all by hand. No ghostwriters, no cuts. His fingers cramped every day. The nerves in his left hand were damaged from cold, but he pushed through. Each page came slow, deliberate, like a man digging through gravel with a spoon. Again. One day in August, he received a visitor he hadn't expected. Major Ellis. The same officer who had once handed him food at Tobruk. James hadn't seen him since the day he was captured. "Didn't think you were still alive," James said, not unkindly. Ellis smiled, older now, with lines around his eyes and a cane by his side. "Didn't think you were still trying to break out after the 5th time. Didn't see any better options." They talked for hours. Ellis told him the rest of the story, how the surrender at Tobruk had fractured command, how most officers were sent elsewhere, how he'd ended up in another camp and had only heard whispers of James's escape attempts. I kept hearing, "The Brit who won't stop." And I thought, that's Halbrook. Has to be. Before he left, Ellis said something that stuck. "You didn't just escape, James. You exposed them. You cracked the mask they wear for the world." James didn't reply. But that night, he wrote 3 more pages. The book finished in September. By then, the Allies were making steady gains in France. Paris had been liberated. There was talk of the war turning, of Germany getting desperate, but James stayed focused. The manuscript was sent to publishers, rejected by the first few. Too raw, they said, too real. They wanted a polished version, one with arcs, with heroes, with endings. James refused. Eventually, a smaller publisher, run by a veteran who had seen Dunkirk, agreed. He didn't change a word. When 10 Tries to Freedom came out in November, it wasn't a bestseller, but it found its way into barracks, into aid stations, into refugee shelters. Soldiers read it by candlelight. Civilians sent letters. Survivors of other camps began writing their own stories. One letter James received stood out. It came from a young sergeant stationed in Belgium. He'd been captured in '43, escaped once. Caught, tortured, gave up. Then he read James's story and tried again. The letter ended with, "This time I made it. Because you showed me how not to quit." James folded the letter, hands trembling. This was the reason he hadn't stopped. Not for medals, not for speeches, but for that. For the man who needed one more push. For the next man ready to try again. Because freedom, James knew better than anyone, wasn't just something you hoped for. It was something you fought for, again, and again, and again. The winter of 1944 brought new challenges. Not from barbed wire or bayonets this time, but from within. James's body had survived escape, but not untouched. The frostbite in his toes had worsened. Doctors warned he might lose 2 more. His lungs wheezed on cold mornings. The infection in his arm flared every few weeks. Still, he refused to rest. The War Office had shifted its view of him. No longer just a man who escaped, but a mouthpiece they couldn't fully control. His book was spreading, slowly but surely. It had reached Geneva, the Red Cross, even a few desks in Washington. And with every chapter, it told the uncomfortable truth, that prisoners of war weren't just statistics. They were men crushed, humiliated, and in some cases, abandoned. One morning, a thin envelope arrived from the International Committee of the Red Cross. They had read his account. They were requesting a meeting. It was unusual. A former POW advising a global organization. But they'd never seen a record as detailed, as brutally honest, as James's. He agreed, but only if it led to real change. In Geneva, he sat across from diplomats in suits, translators at their sides, their hands clean, their shoes polished. James, in his worn coat and walking stick, looked out of place, but he spoke clearly, firmly. He told them what he saw, what was done, what was ignored. Your name was written on crates of supplies that never reached us, on letters we never received, on promises we never felt. Silence followed. Some shifted in their seats. Others wrote notes. One older man nodded slowly. Then help us fix it. That marked the beginning of a different war for James. One without bullets, but just as vital. He worked with Red Cross investigators to identify patterns of abuse. He helped draft new guidelines for inspections. When the war ended, and it was now clear that it would end, they wanted his help establishing protocols for post-war trials. But James had one condition. Don't let the worst of them vanish behind surrender papers. He meant the camp commanders, the guards who beat men for sport, the officers who pretended not to hear screams from the punishment blocks. James provided names, descriptions, routines, anything he remembered. When the Allies began rounding up Nazi officers in early '45, several from Camp 14B were arrested. One of them, a Hauptfeldwebel known to the prisoners as the Bull, was found hiding in Austria. James was called to identify him. He didn't flinch when they brought the man in. The Bull looked older, now, thinner, eyes hollow. But James would never forget the man who'd broken Reggie's ribs for singing a British hymn, who'd once thrown another prisoner into solitary for coughing too loud. The soldier looked at James. Recognition dawned. You, he muttered. The one who ran. James just stared. 9 times, he said. And you never stopped me. Not really. The Bull was sentenced within months. Justice didn't erase the past, but it mattered. James returned to England that spring, his body weaker, his gait slower, but his purpose sharper than ever. He resumed writing, not stories now but affidavits, reports, testimonies. He met with families of missing soldiers, gave them closure when he could. He even visited the parents of the 2 boys who helped him dig the final tunnel, the one that collapsed. Their eyes watered when he spoke, but they thanked him. Said it meant everything to know they didn't die alone. James never stopped, never looked for praise. If someone called him a hero, he'd shake his head. No, I'm the proof they existed. And deep down, he knew the truth. The escapes weren't just for him. They were for the men who couldn't, the ones still buried in silence, the ones whose names would only live if he kept telling their story. By the time summer of 1945 arrived and the war in Europe officially ended, James Halbrook was already back in the shadows, not forgotten, but deliberately quiet. While London celebrated with cheers and confetti, he sat in a modest flat in South Kensington, sifting through letters from families still waiting to hear what had happened to their sons, husbands, brothers. Most he couldn't answer. Too many faces, too many names blurred by starvation, wounds, madness. Some he remembered clearly, like the Australian who died clutching a photo of his fiancée, or the South African who never spoke but shared half his bread every night. But for every one of those, there were dozens who disappeared during beatings, illness or suicide. James had to write the same painful truth over and over again. I'm sorry. I remember him. He was brave. He fought to the end. The British military wanted him to take a medal, the Distinguished Service Order, a rare honor for a POW. James declined. Give it to someone who won something, he told the officer who offered it. You won your freedom, the man replied. James shook his head. No, I survived mine. Still, pressure came. A member of Parliament asked him to speak publicly. A rally for returning veterans, to boost morale. James considered it for a week. Then, finally, he agreed. The speech was held in a town hall in Birmingham. Nearly 500 soldiers and civilians packed in. Some had read his book, others had only heard rumors. The man who tried to escape 10 times and never quit. A folk hero to some, a madman to others. He walked onto the stage slowly, the limp in his leg more pronounced now. He didn't wear his uniform, just a plain gray coat, open collar, no medals. He stood at the podium, looked at the crowd, cleared his throat. I am not here, he began, to tell you how I escaped. I'm here to tell you why I had to. Silence. I didn't escape because I was brave. I escaped because staying meant rotting, because every day in that camp felt like a slow erasure of who I was. And every time I got caught, I learned something. About them, about me. And I kept going because it was better to be beaten trying than to sit quietly and watch others die inside their own heads. No one clapped. They just listened. He told them about the tunnel that collapsed and trapped them in darkness for hours. About the guard who let a prisoner freeze outside for sneezing during roll call. About the way you forget the sound of your own language if no one speaks it near you for long enough. And he ended with one line. Being free was worth more than being safe, and I'd do it all again, even knowing what it would cost. Afterward, men came to shake his hand, some with tears in their eyes. One man, missing a leg, American accent, said, "I was captured in Belgium. Heard about you through the wire. Gave me hope, you know, that someone out there kept fighting even without a weapon." James didn't say anything, just nodded. That was enough. But not long after, another letter arrived. This one from the War Office. They wanted him to consult for the Allied Tribunal, not just to testify about war crimes, but to assist in interrogating former German officers, specifically ones who'd run the POW camps. They said his insight was valuable, that he understood the enemy mindset. He read the letter 3 times, then folded it, and burned it, because James had done enough remembering, enough talking about cages and cruelty. He didn't want to spend the rest of his life chasing ghosts of the men who broke others. He wanted to live. He wanted peace. So he picked up his walking stick, stepped outside, and started walking. No destination, just forward. Because after all the running, all the hiding, all the desperate crawling, he finally could. James walked, not with urgency, not with purpose, just the quiet, steady rhythm of a man learning how to exist outside of barbed wire. Every step was a reminder that no one was watching him anymore. No guards shouting commands, no roll calls, no dogs. The world had turned back to something quieter, something unrecognizable. Sometimes he walked through parks, watched children chase kites across open grass. He'd stand there a while, hands in his coat pockets, listening to their laughter like it was a sound from another planet. Sometimes he wandered into cafes and sat at the edge, sipping black tea, watching life move on around him. It was strange, how the world carried on, he thought, even after everything. At night he still dreamed of fences, of the dog's teeth in his arm, of Reggie gasping for air in a dirt tunnel, of the guard's boot across his face. He'd wake up choking, heart racing, fingers clenched around the edges of the blanket like it was a rifle. But every morning, he'd remind himself, "There's no cage here. You're not in Bavaria. You made it out." In early autumn, he rented a small cottage in Devon, something modest, by the edge of a forest, far from the noise. He told no one, not even the War Office. It was the first decision in years that was entirely his own. He spent his days gardening. Not well. His hands weren't made for delicate work anymore, but he tried. Carrots mostly, potatoes, things that didn't ask too much of you. He read books in the afternoons, fell asleep in a chair by the fire, and walked the nearby hills before sunset. There was peace in routine. Then one day, a knock at the door. James opened it to find a woman standing there. Late 30s, red scarf, tired eyes. In her hand, a yellowed envelope. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Are you James Halbrook?" He hesitated. "Depends who's asking." She gave a faint smile. "Margaret Lawson, Reggie's sister." His heart clenched. He let her in, made tea. They sat in silence for a long time before she finally spoke again. "You wrote to my parents. After the war. They passed away last year. I found your letter in a drawer." James looked down at his hands. "They deserved better than what I gave them." "No," she said. "You gave them something they clung to. You told them who he was at the end. No one else ever did." He didn't know what to say. She pulled out the envelope. Inside, a photograph, creased, faded, but unmistakable. 4 young men, arms slung around each other. Reggie in the middle. James off to the side, unsmiling, always watching. "We thought maybe, if you'd like to keep this." His hand trembled as he took it. He stared at that picture for a long time, longer than he realized. When he looked up, Margaret was crying quietly. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I just wanted to meet the man he believed in." James shook his head. "I was just a man trying not to disappear. But you didn't," she said. "You didn't disappear. You fought. That matters." When she left, he walked back into the house slowly, sat down in his chair, held the photo like it was glass, and for the first time in months, he let the tears fall. not because of pain or regret, but because someone had remembered, someone had cared enough to find him. And in that moment, surrounded by silence and memory, James Halbrook realized something he'd never quite accepted before. He hadn't just escaped a camp. He had escaped erasure. The photograph stayed on the mantel after that. No frame, just tucked between two old books, edges curling. James looked at it every morning. Sometimes he spoke to it. A quiet nod. "A morning, lads." It felt foolish, but comforting, like the faces frozen in that picture were still watching, still waiting for him to keep going. But things had changed since Margaret's visit. The silence wasn't enough anymore. James began writing again. Not books, not testimonies, just letters. Dozens of them. To families he'd once been too afraid to contact. The ones he'd skipped over because their sons had died ugly, quiet deaths. Or because he couldn't remember a last name. Or because guilt had sat too heavy on his chest. Now, he forced himself. "Your son gave up his blanket for a sick man," he wrote in one. "He sang every night, even when they beat him," he wrote in another. "I didn't know him long, but he smiled at me the morning I tried escape number 4. It didn't matter how small the detail was, he shared it. Because someone, somewhere, needed to know that their boy had mattered. Some families wrote back. Others didn't. Some sent photographs. One sent a medal, asking James to hold on to it for someone who deserved it. He buried that one under the floorboard, next to the tin spoon he'd used to dig the early tunnels. He never wanted medals. He wanted memory. In the evenings, he walked the hills near the cottage. The breeze didn't bite like Bavaria. The trees didn't carry shouts. Sometimes a child's voice in the distance would make him flinch, but not like before. He was healing. Not fixed, not whole, but healing. One evening, as he returned home, he found another envelope on the doorstep. No return address. Inside, a single piece of paper. Typed. "To the man who wouldn't stay put. You don't know me, but my father talked about you before. He passed. Said if it wasn't for the sound of you fighting the guards during that second tunnel escape, he never would have had the chance to hide. He made it back in 45. Had 3 kids. One of them is me. Thank you for giving him a second shot at life. No name. Just a son of freedom." James folded the letter with shaking hands. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, that letter gripped tightly in his hand. He'd spent so long thinking he had only survived, that he had endured the camps but hadn't changed anything, hadn't saved anyone, hadn't won anything. But maybe he had in small, quiet ways, in shouts in the night, in half-dug tunnels, in moments that passed too quickly to feel heroic, but mattered deeply to someone else. The next morning he packed a bag, not for escape, but for return. Not to Germany, that war was over, but to the others who'd escaped, the ones like him who had survived and then vanished. He'd heard rumors of small gatherings in London, unofficial circles of former POWs. Quiet men. Men who'd lived through hell and didn't know how to rejoin the world. He was one of them, and maybe now, he could help. James boarded a train north, coat buttoned, cane in hand, the photo still in his pocket. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't walking away from something. He was walking toward it. The gathering was held in a dusty church basement just outside of Manchester. No signs, no official group name, just a word passed quietly between former POWs, like a code from another life. Thursday after dusk. James arrived early. The room was bare, folding chairs, a table with stale biscuits and cold tea, a bulletin, board with tattered newspaper clippings. But there was something in the air that felt different from any hospital ward or military office he'd ever stepped into. The men came in slowly, some with limps, some with canes, some with eyes that flinched at sudden movement. James recognized none of them, but he knew all of them. A tall, gaunt man with a missing ear spoke first. "This isn't therapy. We don't do speeches here. We just talk if we want to, or sit or remember." So James sat. For a while he listened. One man talked about how he still hid food in his sock drawer, decades after liberation. Another confessed he couldn't sleep unless a light was on. Another hadn't been touched, hugged, in years. Said the idea of hands on him brought it all back. Then someone recognized James. "Wait, you're him. Halbrook. 10 tries, right?" James nodded quietly. Murmurs spread. They didn't swarm him. They didn't ask for details. They didn't romanticize what he'd done. They just nodded. Respectful. Silent. Later, a wiry man with sunken cheeks pulled a chair beside James. "I was at Stalag Luft III. Tried twice, failed both. You gave us hope," he said, staring at the floor. "Even just hearing about someone who kept going. That was enough some days." James didn't know what to say. He'd spent so long trying to forget the image of his broken body being dragged back through those camp gates after another failed attempt. But to these men, those failures weren't shame. They were fuel. Proof that defiance could exist in a place built to destroy it. He returned the next week, and the week after that. It became ritual. A new rhythm. Thursday evenings with men who didn't flinch when he spoke about solitary confinement, or the sound of ribs cracking under a rifle. But men who understood. Eventually, someone suggested compiling their stories, not for the public, not for glory, just for them, for the record, for their families, so they'd know the full truth. Uncut, unpolished. James offered to help. He began, collecting interviews, taped them with an old recorder, transcribed them by hand. Stories of sabotage, resistance, hunger, madness. Stories of kindness, too, of a German nurse who slipped morphine to dying prisoners, of a Russian soldier who shared his bread, of a boy who sang every night until he didn't wake up. One day, a man named Gerald, once a Royal Navy officer, sat across from James and said, "You know, if you'd escaped just once and succeeded, people would have clapped. But it was the 9 failures that mattered most." James blinked. "What? Do you mean?" "Because you didn't run away, James. You ran through. You endured what most of us feared even once. And every time they dragged you back, you looked at them and tried again. That broke something in them. And built something in us." That night, James sat alone in the church basement long after the others had gone. He took out the photograph again. Reggie, the others, young, smiling, hopeful. He looked them in the eyes, and for the first time, whispered, "I did what I could. No shame, no doubt, just truth." He returned home in the rain, slow steps but steady. Every Thursday from then on, he kept going. He wrote, he listened. He preserved the voices that would have been lost, not because he wanted to be remembered, but because they deserved to be. And James Halbrook, the man who failed 9 times and rose 10, knew exactly how to keep them alive. Winter returned to Devon, like an old memory, quiet, cold, and unannounced. James Halbrook, now grayed and stooped, sat near his window, a thin blanket across his knees and a stack of papers beside him. Not books, not speeches, just stories. Dozens of them, each one handwritten, each page bearing the voice of a man who had once been silenced. Testimonies from the forgotten, not generals, not politicians, just prisoners, soldiers, survivors. Human beings who had crawled through the same darkness James once knew, and who had, for too long, carried it alone. Outside, a postman's whistle echoed faintly. James didn't move. He stared at the photograph still perched above the fireplace. Reggie, himself, 2 others, all frozen in time, unaware of the cages ahead. And yet there they were, still watching, still with him. In the final pages of his second manuscript, James wrote a single line that he underlined twice before placing his pen down for the last time. "Freedom isn't the moment the gates open. It's the choice to keep walking once you're out." That line became his legacy. The manuscript was published posthumously the following year, titled, "Through the Wire, Voices That Wouldn't Die." It didn't sell in the millions. It wasn't taught in schools, but it mattered. Veterans passed it, hand to hand. Grandchildren read it at kitchen tables. In one French classroom, a teacher closed the book and asked a room full of teenagers, "What would you do on try number 10? It mattered. James Halbrook died quietly in his sleep, in the same chair where he had once wept holding Reggie's picture. No fanfare, no medals on display, just silence and peace. But his story lives, etched into memory not because of his escape, but because of the refusal to surrender when failure was guaranteed. That defiance, that relentless fight for meaning, is what echoed across generations. And now it's your turn. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more untold, unpolished truths of the men history tried to forget. Drop a comment below. What would you have done after the fifth failure? Would you have kept going? Your words keep their memories alive. Your voice might be the echo someone else needs. Be part of the reason they're never erased.